The sun hung low over the dusty plains of Millbrook County, casting long shadows across the railroad tracks that cut through the heart of the American frontier. The year was 1887, and the small town of Cedar Falls had seen better days. Once a thriving stop along the transcontinental railroad, it now struggled to maintain its place in a rapidly changing world. Thomas Cowman Mackenzie rode his weathered horse along the familiar path beside the tracks, his eyes scanning the horizon with the practiced vigilance of a man who had learned to trust no one. At 43, Cowman carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who had seen too much and said too little. His face, weathered by years under the unforgiving sun, bore the lines of a man haunted by choices he could never undo. The townspeople of Cedar Falls knew little about Cowman's past, and he preferred it that way. He lived alone in a modest cabin on the outskirts of town, working odd jobs and keeping to himself. Some whispered he was a former lawman who had lost his badge in disgrace. Others claimed he was a gunslinger trying to escape his reputation. The truth, as it often is, was far more complicated. As the evening light began to fade, Cowman's horse suddenly stopped, ears pricked forward in alarm. There, beside the railroad tracks, lay a small figure barely visible in the gathering dusk. Cowman dismounted slowly, his hand instinctively moving to the worn handle of his Colt revolver. The figure was a boy, no more than 8 years old, his clothes torn and dirty, his small frame trembling with cold and hunger. His dark hair was matted with dust, and his pale skin bore the telltale signs of malnutrition. But it was his eyes that struck Cowman most, wide, intelligent, and filled with a terror that no child should ever know. "Easy there, son," Cowman said softly, kneeling beside the boy. "I'm not going to hurt you." The child flinched at the sound of his voice but didn't run. In his small fist he clutched a crumpled piece of paper, holding it as if his life depended on it. Cowman could see the boy's lips moving silently, but no words came out. "What's your name, boy?" Cowman asked, his voice gentler than it had been in years. The child looked up at him with those haunting eyes and whispered a single word: "Samuel." Cowman felt something stir in his chest, a feeling he had buried so deep he thought it was gone forever. Compassion. The boy reminded him of someone from long ago, someone he had failed to protect when it mattered most. "Where did you come from, Samuel?" Cowman asked, but the boy only shook his head, tears streaming down his dirt-stained cheeks. As Cowman examined the boy more closely, he noticed something troubling. Samuel's wrists bore faint marks, as if he had been bound. His clothes, though torn and dirty, were of good quality, not the rough garments of a typical orphan. Someone had taken great care to dress this child well before. Before what? The sound of an approaching train whistle echoed across the plains, and Samuel's eyes widened in terror. He scrambled backward, pressing himself against Cowman as if seeking protection from some unseen threat. "It's all right, son," Cowman said, wrapping his coat around the trembling boy. "You're safe now." But even as he spoke the words, Cowman wondered if they were true. Something about this situation felt wrong, dangerous. Every instinct told him to walk away, to leave the boy for someone else to find. He had learned long ago that getting involved in other people's problems only led to heartache. Yet as he looked down at Samuel's frightened face, Cowman made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He couldn't abandon this child, not when he had the power to help. "Come on, Samuel," he said, lifting the boy onto his horse. "Let's get you somewhere warm and safe." As they rode toward Cedar Falls, Cowman couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The shadows seemed to move with purpose, and more than once he thought he heard the sound of hoofbeats in the distance. But each time he turned to look, there was nothing but empty prairie. The town of Cedar Falls lay ahead, its windows glowing with warm lamplight. But Cowman knew that bringing Samuel there would raise questions. Questions he wasn't sure he was ready to answer. The townspeople were already suspicious of him, and arriving with a mysterious child would only fuel their distrust. As they approached the outskirts of town, Samuel suddenly spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're coming for me." Cowman felt a chill run down his spine. "Who's coming for you, son?" But Samuel had fallen silent again, clutching that mysterious piece of paper even tighter. Whatever secrets the boy carried, Cowman realized, they were about to thrust both of them into a web of danger that neither of them was prepared for. The first chapter of their story was just beginning, and already the shadows of the past were reaching out to claim them both. The morning sun cast harsh light through the windows of Martha's boarding house as Cowman sat beside Samuel's bed, watching the boy sleep fitfully. They had arrived in Cedar Falls under the cover of darkness, and Martha Henderson, one of the few people in town who didn't immediately judge Cowman, had agreed to give them shelter, though her questions were many and her concerns evident. Samuel had barely touched the warm soup Martha had prepared, and his sleep was plagued by nightmares that left him crying out in the darkness. Cowman had stayed by his side all night, a vigil that reminded him painfully of another time, another child he had failed to protect. "Thomas," Martha whispered from the doorway, "Sheriff Dalton is downstairs. He wants to speak with you." Cowman's jaw tightened. Sheriff Marcus Dalton was a good man, but he was also thorough. Too thorough for Cowman's comfort. He nodded to Martha and made his way downstairs, where Dalton waited with his hat in his hands and concern etched across his weathered face. "Morning, Cowman," Dalton said, his voice carefully neutral. "Heard you brought in a young one last night." "Found him by the tracks," Cowman replied simply. "Looked like he needed help." Dalton studied him for a long moment. "Funny thing about that. Got a telegram this morning from the territorial marshal. Seems there's been some trouble up north. A family murdered, their young son missing. Description matches your boy pretty closely." Cowman felt his blood run cold, but he kept his expression neutral. "That so?" "The thing is," Dalton continued, "the family that was killed, the Weatherbys, they were involved in some unsavory business. Word is they were part of a network that, well, let's just say they dealt in things that decent folks don't talk about." The implication hung heavy in the air. Human trafficking. It was a plague that had followed the railroad west, preying on the desperate and the vulnerable. If Samuel had escaped from such people, it would explain his terror, his reluctance to speak. "What are you saying, Sheriff?" Cowman asked. "I'm saying that boy upstairs might be in more danger than you realize, and bringing him here might have put this whole town at risk." Before Cowman could respond, the sound of multiple horses approaching echoed from the street outside. Through the window, they could see a group of well-dressed men dismounting from expensive horses, men who clearly didn't belong in a frontier town like Cedar Falls. "Gentlemen," the leader called out as he approached the boarding house, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "We're looking for a missing child. We have reason to believe he might be in this establishment." Sheriff Dalton stepped outside, Cowman close behind him. The leader of the group was a tall, thin man with cold eyes and an expensive suit that marked him as someone from back east. His companions were clearly hired guns, their hands resting casually on their weapons. "I'm Sheriff Dalton," the lawman said firmly. "State your business." "Mr. Cornelius Blackwood," the man replied with a thin smile. "I represent certain interests that have been affected by a recent tragedy. We're looking for a boy, about 8 years old, dark hair. He was taken from his rightful guardians, and we've come to return him to safety." Cowman's instincts screamed danger. Everything about Blackwood felt wrong, from his too smooth manner to the way his men positioned themselves strategically around the building. Don't know anything about any missing boy, Dalton said carefully. Blackwood's smile never wavered, but his eyes grew colder. Perhaps you'd allow us to search the premises? I'm sure it's just a misunderstanding, but we really must be thorough. Not without a warrant, Dalton replied firmly. Sheriff, Blackwood said, his voice taking on a threatening edge, I think you misunderstand the situation. This boy is extremely valuable to certain people who don't take kindly to interference. It would be unfortunate if this charming little town were to experience any unpleasantness. The threat was clear, and Cowman saw several townspeople who had gathered to watch the confrontation step back nervously. Cedar Falls was a peaceful community, unprepared for the kind of violence that men like Blackwood brought with them. You threatening my town? Dalton asked, his hand moving to his gun. Not at all, Blackwood replied smoothly, merely pointing out that cooperation would be in everyone's best interest. It was then that Samuel appeared at the upstairs window, his pale face pressed against the glass. The moment Blackwood's men saw him, their hands moved to their weapons, and Cowman knew that the time for talking was over. Samuel! Blackwood called out, his voice suddenly warm and paternal. There you are, my boy. Come down now. Your family is worried sick about you. But Samuel's reaction was immediate and terrifying. He screamed, a sound of pure terror that cut through the morning air like a knife. He disappeared from the window, and moments later they could hear him sobbing hysterically inside the boarding house. That boy doesn't want to go with you, Cowman said quietly, stepping forward. Blackwood's mask of civility finally slipped. And who might you be? Someone who doesn't like seeing children scared, Cowman replied, his hand resting on his gun. How noble, Blackwood sneered. But you don't understand what you're dealing with, cowboy. That boy belongs to us, and we will have him back. Over my dead body, Cowman said simply. Blackwood studied him for a long moment, then smiled coldly. That can be arranged. The tension in the air was palpable as the two groups faced off in the dusty street. The townspeople watched from doorways and windows, sensing that their quiet community was about to be shattered by forces beyond their understanding. I'm giving you 1 hour, Blackwood announced loudly, ensuring everyone could hear. Produce the boy, or this town will learn what happens to those who interfere with our business. As Blackwood and his men rode away, Sheriff Dalton turned to Cowman with grim determination. Looks like we've got ourselves a fight. Cowman nodded, but his mind was already racing. He had to protect Samuel, but he also had to protect the innocent people of Cedar Falls. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a terrible suspicion was beginning to form about why these men wanted the boy so desperately. The crumpled paper Samuel clutched so tightly, what secrets did it contain? And why was Cowman beginning to suspect that this wasn't just about human trafficking, but something far more sinister? As the hour deadline approached, Cowman realized that the real battle was just beginning. The town hall of Cedar Falls had never seen such a gathering. As word spread about Blackwood's ultimatum, nearly every resident had crowded into the small building, their faces etched with fear and uncertainty. Mayor William Hartwell, a portly man in his 60s, stood at the front of the room, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool evening air. Now, folks, Mayor Hartwell began, his voice shaking slightly, we need to discuss this situation calmly and rationally. Rationally? Shouted Jake Morrison, the town's blacksmith. Those men threatened our entire town, all because this drifter brought in some kid. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, and Cowman felt the weight of their stares. He stood at the back of the room, Samuel pressed close to his side, the boy's small hand clutching his coat. The boy needs protection, Cowman said quietly, but his voice carried in the tense silence. Protection from what? Demanded Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard, the banker's wife. How do we even know what he's done? Maybe he belongs with those men. You saw how terrified he was, Martha Henderson interjected, standing up from her seat. That child has been through something terrible. Sheriff Dalton stepped forward, raising his hand for silence. I've been thinking about this situation, and there's something that doesn't add up. Blackwood claimed the boy was taken from his rightful guardians, but he never mentioned family. And that telegram about the murdered family, the Weatherbys, they weren't described as guardians. They were described as victims. Dr. Benjamin Hayes, the town's physician who had examined Samuel earlier, stood up slowly. There's something else, he said, his voice grave. The boy has scars, old ones. Someone has been hurting this child for a long time. A shocked silence fell over the room. Cowman felt Samuel tremble beside him and placed a protective hand on the boy's shoulder. What kind of scars? Sheriff Dalton asked. Dr. Hayes hesitated, glancing at Samuel with compassion. The kind that come from systematic abuse. This boy has been someone's prisoner. The revelation sent a wave of horror through the crowd. Even the most vocal opponents of helping Samuel fell silent, confronted with the reality of what the child had endured. It was then that Samuel, who had remained silent throughout the meeting, suddenly spoke up. His voice was small, but clear. I can read. The simple statement seemed odd until Samuel reached into his pocket and pulled out the crumpled piece of paper he had been clutching since Cowman found him. With trembling hands, he unfolded it and held it up. It's a list, Samuel whispered. Names and numbers. Mr. Blackwood made me memorize it before the bad men came to our house. Sheriff Dalton carefully took the paper from Samuel's hands. As he read it, his face grew pale. Dear God, he breathed. What is it? Mayor Hartwell demanded. Dalton looked up, his expression grim. It's a ledger. Names, ages, prices, and destinations. This is a record of human trafficking operations across 3 territories. The room erupted in shocked gasps and angry murmurs. But Dalton wasn't finished. And there's more, he continued, his voice heavy with disbelief. Some of these names, they're people from our own territory. People who were reported missing over the past 2 years. Cowman felt a chill run down his spine as the full scope of the situation became clear. Samuel wasn't just a victim. He was a witness to one of the largest criminal operations in the region. The boy memorized this entire list, Dr. Hayes said in amazement. He's been forced to be their record keeper. Samuel nodded sadly. Mr. Blackwood said I was special because I could remember numbers and names. He said if I ever forgot or told anyone, he would hurt the other children. The weight of Samuel's burden settled over the room like a shroud. This 8-year-old boy had been carrying the names and fates of dozens of victims, forced to be complicit in their suffering to protect others. There's something else, Samuel continued, his voice growing stronger. Mr. Blackwood isn't the real boss. There's someone else. Someone important who comes to visit sometimes. Someone from a big city. Who? Dalton asked gently. Samuel looked around the room, his young face serious beyond his years. I only heard his name once. Mr. Blackwood called him Senator. The revelation hit the room like a thunderbolt. A senator, a man with political power and influence, was involved in this horrific network. No wonder Blackwood was so confident. So threatening. He had protection at the highest levels. Now I understand why they want the boy back so badly, Cowman said grimly. He's not just a witness. He's evidence that could bring down their entire operation. Mayor Hartwell sank into his chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they faced. What are we supposed to do against a senator? We protect the boy, Cowman said firmly. And we make sure this list gets to the right people. People who can't be bought or intimidated. But Blackwood will be back, Jake Morrison pointed out. and he won't come alone next time." It was then that an unexpected voice spoke up from the back of the room. "Maybe it's time this town remembered how to fight." Everyone turned to see old Pete Garrison, a grizzled former cavalry soldier who rarely spoke at town meetings. Despite his age, there was steel in his eyes and strength in his voice. "I've been listening to all this talk about what we can't do," Pete continued, standing slowly, "but I haven't heard much about what we can do. This boy came to us for help, and by God, we're going to help him." "Pete's right," Martha Henderson said, standing as well. "We can't just hand over a child to those monsters." One by one, other townspeople began to stand. The school teacher, Miss Sarah Collins, the general store owner, Henry Walsh. Even Mrs. Pritchard, who had been so vocal in her opposition, rose from her seat. "What are you all doing?" Mayor Hartwell asked nervously. "What's right?" Sheriff Dalton said simply. "We're going to protect this boy, and we're going to make sure justice is served." Cowman felt a warmth in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years. These people, this community, were willing to risk everything for a child they barely knew. It reminded him why he had once believed in justice, why he had once worn a badge with pride. But as the townspeople began to organize their defense, Cowman couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something important. Blackwood had been too confident, too sure of himself. There was another piece to this puzzle, something that would change everything. As if reading his thoughts, Samuel tugged on his coat. "Mr. Cowman," the boy whispered, "there's something else I need to tell you. Something about why they really want me back." Cowman knelt down to Samuel's level, sensing that whatever the boy was about to reveal would be the key to everything. "What is it, son?" Samuel's eyes filled with tears, but his voice was steady. "I'm not just a witness, Mr. Cowman. I'm the senator's son." The revelation hit Cowman like a physical blow. Everything suddenly made sense. The expensive clothes, the careful treatment despite the abuse, the desperate need to recover the boy at any cost. Samuel wasn't just evidence of the senator's crimes. He was living proof of the man's ultimate corruption, a father who had sold his own son into the very network he helped operate. As the full implications of this revelation sank in, Cowman realized that their fight was about to become much more dangerous than anyone had imagined. The pre-dawn darkness hung heavy over Cedar Falls as Cowman made his final preparations. In just a few hours, Blackwood would return with reinforcements, expecting to find a frightened town ready to surrender Samuel. Instead, he would find a community transformed by purpose and united in their determination to protect an innocent child. Samuel sat on the edge of the bed in Martha's boarding house, no longer the terrified, silent boy Cowman had found by the railroad tracks. The revelation of his true identity had lifted a terrible burden from his small shoulders. For the first time since his ordeal began, he was no longer alone with his secrets. "Are you scared, Mr. Cowman?" Samuel asked, his young voice steady despite the gravity of their situation. Cowman considered the question carefully. "Yes, son, but sometimes being scared is what makes us brave. My real father," Samuel said quietly, "he wasn't always bad. I remember when I was little, before the drinking got worse, before he started making deals with bad people. He used to read me stories about heroes." "What kind of heroes?" Cowman asked, sitting beside the boy. "The kind who saved people, even when it was dangerous, even when they were scared." Samuel looked up at Cowman with eyes that held wisdom far beyond his years. "You're like one of those heroes, aren't you?" Cowman felt a tightness in his throat. "I'm just a man trying to do what's right. That's what heroes are," Samuel said simply. Outside, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the morning air. Blackwood had returned, and he had brought an army. Sheriff Dalton appeared in the doorway. "They're here. At least 20 men, maybe more. They've got the town surrounded." Cowman stood, checking his weapons one final time. Remember the plan. No matter what happens, Samuel stays safe." As they made their way downstairs, Cowman was amazed by what he saw. The townspeople of Cedar Falls had transformed their quiet community into a fortress. Barricades blocked the main streets. Sharpshooters were positioned on rooftops, and every able-bodied person was armed and ready to fight. Martha Henderson handed Cowman a cup of coffee, her hands steady despite the danger. "Thomas," she said quietly, "I want you to know that whatever happens today, you've given this town something it had lost." "What's that?" "A reason to believe in something bigger than ourselves." The sound of Blackwood's voice carried across the town square as he called out his demands. "People of Cedar Falls, you have one last chance to avoid bloodshed. Send out the boy, and we'll leave peacefully." Sheriff Dalton stepped out onto the main street, his badge gleaming in the morning light. "The only thing leaving this town today will be you and your men." Blackwood's laughter was cold and mocking. "Sheriff, you're outnumbered 3-1. This is your last warning." "Then you'd better make your peace with God," came the unexpected reply from old Pete Garrison, who had positioned himself on the roof of the general store with a rifle that had seen service in a dozen battles. What followed was unlike anything Cedar Falls had ever witnessed. The battle was fierce but brief, as the townspeople fought with the desperation of parents protecting their children. Blackwood's hired guns, accustomed to intimidating defenseless victims, found themselves facing determined defenders who knew every inch of their town. But it was Cowman who ended the conflict in a way no one expected. As Blackwood himself advanced on the boarding house where Samuel was hidden, Cowman stepped out to face him alone. "It's over, Blackwood," Cowman said calmly. "Your men are defeated, and help is on the way." "Help?" Blackwood sneered, drawing his gun. "Who's gonna help you, cowboy?" "The United States Marshal Service," came a voice from behind Blackwood. The criminal spun around to find himself facing a group of federal marshals, led by a stern-faced man with silver hair and a badge that gleamed with authority. "Marshal Robert Sterling," the man announced. "Mr. Blackwood, you're under arrest for human trafficking, murder, and conspiracy." Blackwood's face went white. "You can't arrest me. I have protection. Senator Morrison will—" "Senator Morrison is already in custody," Sterling interrupted. "Turns out when you have a detailed ledger of his crimes and the testimony of his own son, even political connections can't save you." As the marshals took Blackwood and his remaining men into custody, Cowman felt a hand slip into his. Samuel stood beside him, no longer afraid, no longer alone. "How did you know to come?" Sheriff Dalton asked Marshal Sterling. Sterling smiled and placed a hand on Cowman's shoulder. "Because Thomas Mackenzie sent word 3 days ago. You see, Sheriff, Mr. Mackenzie here isn't just any drifter. He's a former federal marshal himself, one of the best we ever had." The revelation stunned the townspeople. Cowman, their mysterious loner, had been a lawman after all. "I lost my badge 5 years ago," Cowman explained quietly. "Made a mistake that cost innocent lives. I thought I was done with law enforcement forever. But you never stopped being a marshal where it counted," Sterling said. "In here." He tapped his chest over his heart. As the dust settled and the prisoners were loaded into wagons, the people of Cedar Falls gathered in the town square. Samuel stood before them, no longer a frightened orphan but a brave young boy who had helped bring down one of the most dangerous criminal networks in the territory. "What happens to Samuel now?" Martha Henderson asked. Marshal Sterling smiled. "Well, that's up to him. His father will be going to prison for a very long time, but the boy needs a family, a real family." Samuel looked around at the faces of the people who had risked everything to protect him. Then he looked up at Cowman, the man who had found him by the railroad tracks and given him hope. "I want to stay here," Samuel said firmly. "This is my family now." Mayor Hartwell stepped forward, his voice thick with emotion. Samuel Morrison, or should I say Samuel Mackenzie, would you like to become an official citizen of Cedar Falls? The boy's face lit up with the first genuine smile anyone had seen from him. Yes, sir. I'd like that very much. As the crowd cheered, Cowman knelt down to Samuel's level. Are you sure about this, son? It won't be easy starting over. Samuel threw his arms around Cowman's neck. You taught me that heroes aren't the ones who aren't scared. They're the ones who do what's right even when they are scared. I want to learn to be a hero like you. 6 months later, the town of Cedar Falls had returned to its peaceful ways, but it was forever changed. The railroad brought new visitors who had heard the story of the community that stood up to corruption and evil. Samuel attended school with the other children, his quick mind and gentle nature making him beloved by all. Cowman had accepted the position of town marshal, his badge restored by a grateful federal government. But more importantly, he had found something he thought he had lost forever, a family and a purpose. On quiet evenings, he and Samuel would sit on the porch of their small house watching the trains pass by on the tracks where their story had begun. Samuel would read aloud from his school books, his voice strong and confident, no longer the whispered words of a frightened child. Mr. Cowman, Samuel said one evening as they watched the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. Do you think there are other children out there who need help? Cowman smiled, understanding the question behind the question. I'm sure there are, son. Maybe someday when I'm older, I can help them too. I think you already are, Cowman replied, thinking of the letters Samuel had begun writing to other children who had been rescued from similar situations. Every day you show them that there's hope, that there are people who care. That's the most important kind of help there is. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, father and son sat together in comfortable silence, two souls who had found each other in the darkness and discovered that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with a simple act of kindness. The story of Loner Cowman and the boy by the railroad tracks had become legend in Cedar Falls, a reminder that heroes aren't born. They're made by the choices they make when faced with the opportunity to do what's right. And in a world that often seemed dark and unforgiving, their story served as a beacon of hope, proving that redemption is always possible, and that sometimes saving someone else is the first step to saving yourself. Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much, and come back often.